surprise at the short time it took for this declaration to occur. Was it something that took you by surprise?
No, not really, not really. And remember, this is a culmination of a years-long work with our Sherpa teams and the various ministerial teams in different working groups as well as tracks, and also engagements with different sectorial groups that have been part of the G20 process. So that's number one. And so we've been seeking to build consensus along the way. Obviously, the last week or so was the final sort of stretch where every word was now being scrutinized, every comma was being scrutinized, and there were intense negotiations and debates over various elements of the text. What was important was the spirit that characterized that process, with every participating country working towards ensuring consensus at the end of the day and ensuring a successful outcome. You know, the G20 accords the responsibility of leadership and coordination to one country, but it's really a multilateral platform, if you like, not that it exceeds or sees itself above the UN, but it's where all the member countries take joint and collective responsibility in ensuring the success of a summit and its year. And so what we now have is a declaration that places at the center of the global development agenda Africa, the global south, along with key issues that are pertinent to the development of the global south as well as Africa. And that is something to be enormously proud of and excited about. And these are issues that we're going to certainly, from a South African point of view, and I will safely say even from an African point of view with the African Union, that we're going to continue advancing and taking forward to make sure that we sustain the legacy that is going to be left behind by South Africa's led G20.
Multilateralism, do you feel that this G20 has enhanced the term multilateralism in order to make sure that the world is seen in a unified way?
Absolutely. The manner in which consensus was reached, what surprised you? The early adoption at the start of the summit of the declaration, the speed in which the summit adopted the declaration. It's a huge win for multilateralism. It's a massive recognition that no country, whether rich or poor, can go it alone or do it alone in resolving some of the challenges facing the globe, and also in seizing some of the opportunities that are presented to us. And so global cooperation, global collaboration has been given a firm stamp of approval by this summit.
Vincent, one of the questions that came earlier on, and I was discussing this with our lead analyst, Dr. Imran Burkus, was, can the G20, and I know obviously the G20 doesn't have a sort of legal binding mechanism to it. You, on a number of occasions, have spoken about what is happening in Gaza, and Israel continues to violate the ceasefire agreement that happens there. How does something like a G20 or a bloc like the G20 really hold Israel accountable? I ask this because there are two major nations within the G20, France and the United Kingdom, that have this unwavering support in terms of arms exports and trade exports. So has there been discussions with President Ramaphosa in maybe convincing these nations to take a bit of a harder stance on Israel, given these violations of the ceasefire that are happening in Gaza?
So 2 points to that question. The first point is, does this declaration cover the Palestinian issue? It does.
Sure.
In the context of the four most gravest conflicts currently taking place in the world, namely the DRC, Sudan, Ukraine, and Palestine.
Sure.
And what the declaration says, it says we have to continue looking at being guided by the UN Charter that talks about peaceful resolution of conflicts, that talks about avoiding the use of force where there are issues of dispute. Yes, Israel continues to violate numerous UN resolutions and various provisions of international law. But what are we seeing? We're seeing the world continuing to respond in a more and more unified way. More countries have joined South Africa's ICJ case. Recently at the United Nations, France and Saudi Arabia convened a meeting of global heads of states where more and more countries, including France, affirmed their recognition of the Palestinian state. It is an intractable conflict, but we are slowly making progress and more countries are coming around. And so that's the first point. The second point is, what do we do with these conflicts? And what do we do with this declaration at a bilateral level? There's a lot that we've already started doing, and there's a lot that we're going to continue doing, ensuring that our bilateral agreements are centered around some of these issues, that they include the manner in which we approach these issues. That's the second approach. Then we have the United Nations, which is the multilateral platform where these issues are constantly advanced, advocated, and where we seek that ongoing commitment to principles of international law, as well as adherence to the various UN charters.
One final question, Vincent. We just saw the breaking news now. The US has been barred from the closing ceremony of the G20 summit. I don't know what will develop in the next 24 hours. Can you just clarify that? Yeah.
No, look, there's a great deal of complexity in organizing, setting up, and managing a summit and an event of this magnitude. When we were told that Vice President Vance will be here, we made our teams available to assist his advanced team. It came here. Resources were going to be made available, like they've been made available to all other countries as per their requirements and their needs. Then we were told about a boycott, and we're told about the withdrawal of all US officials. Those resources were shifted to other countries. There are accreditation processes. There's so many other processes. Now, you cannot, at the 11th hour, when the summit is already underway, just at a snap of a finger, reactivate all of those processes when teams have already been redeployed to other areas of the summit. And so I will use the word bad. One will have to just look at the chronology of events and think reasonably what will have been the right thing to do here. The right thing to do from the onset will have not been to boycott the summit. The right thing to do from the onset will have been participating as a member of the G20, engaging on issues that you disagree with, engage with South Africa on issues that you have falsely interpreted instead of a boycott. To then turn around and say you've been bad because you're forwarding an embassy delegation that has given us a long list of demands and courtesies that they must be provided, which cannot be provided at the 11th hour, is false.
1 minute, Vincent. The volatility of relations between Washington and Pretoria. Is Pretoria still willing to go ahead and speak with Washington, given the rhetoric that is coming out from the White House?
We're speaking with Washington. We'll continue to speak to Washington. We're going to be in the Troika with Washington, the G20 Troika, as past president, them as president from the 1st of December, along with the UK. And so we're going to have multiple platforms to engage with the US. For us, this is a temporary blip in what has been a great relationship up until now, and what will continue beyond the Trump era, being a constructive relationship and a great partnership with the US.
Vincent Magwenya, absolute pleasure having you.
Thank you
so much for joining us. That's Vincent Magwenya, the spokesperson for the presidency. Do stay tuned to us here on Mzansi Welcomes the World from day one of the G20 Summit. We'll have more for you after this break. Welcome back to the second session of our G20 Leader Summit. This is Mzansi Welcomes the World. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us on Hilal TV, DSTV channel 347. So much has happened within the last hour and a half. Of course, you've seen the G20 Leaders Declaration has been adopted, and of course there was news going around, yet to be verified, whether the United States has been barred from attending the G20 closing ceremony. And let me tell you, that's the case. It really throws a spanner in the works in terms of the diplomatic tensions that are happening between Pretoria and Washington. And still with me, I'd like to welcome our international relations analyst who's with us for the 2 days here at the G20 summit, Dr. Imran Bukkas. Dr. Bukkas, a lot has happened. A lot has happened in that 1.5 hours that, of course, we were off air. Let's start off, of course, with this declaration. It's a question I asked Vincent Magwenya earlier on. I must confess, I did not expect it to happen within such a short period of time.
Yeah, I think no one did, right? The declaration was expected a lot later. But it's also, I think in some ways, the maverick nature of South Africa, the maverick nature of Ramaphosa. Many of us were doubting that we'll reach a declaration, that we'll perhaps have some kind of communique or a statement. And having a declaration is a big achievement. Of course, the language might be weakened. You know, when it comes to declarations, it's all about the language. And I think there may have been some compromises on the language. But issues like debt sustainability that we see in the declaration, I'm not sure if it's gone in terms of describing debt cancellation to the extent that we'd like, or whether it's calling for debt reformation. Because like we said earlier, a number of African countries, debt impacts their development, right? And at least 50% of countries on the African continent are affected by that. So even our neighbor Mozambique, is certainly not able to service its debt. And of course, we come from a history of odious debt, but we also come in the post-apartheid context of major world debt. The cost of debt, the cost of capital, having to service this debt with multiple currencies, and we have fluctuating currencies. That's a problem. And of course, the structural nature of the debt. And linked to that is Ramaphosa or the declaration talking about the restructuring of these international institutions. I know we spoke about that extensively earlier, but certainly an important point. And while we're talking about that, one starts to think about the BRICS Bank or the New Development Bank, that being an alternative. Of course, we don't know the conditionalities well enough, but the BRICS Bank is certainly an alternative.
When we take this declaration in the context of how it has been presented to us, Dr. Bukkas, and I think the viewer needs to understand that this is not a legally binding agreement. So which means, and I think here's the caveat to all of this, is that the global north, I think the onus is on them to make much more of the commitment to this declaration comes into play. And I think when you look at the rhetoric that's coming from Washington, again, it's something we spoke about earlier on, Dr. Bukkas, no one really knows if the US is going to take this forward. The rhetoric suggests not, but a lot can change in the next 1 year. Herein lies the thing, Dr. Bukkas, the global north's supposed influence in this. They have to step up because it's quite clear it had to be a unanimous declaration.
Yeah, absolutely. Irrespective of what we think about the US, and of course many people are angered by decisions of the US, not only in the context of Gaza, but also historically. The US has a horrid history in Africa, in our case, including in South Africa, during the 80s until about 1986. But there's a huge but. The US remains an important country for South Africa. In terms of trade, 600 US companies in South Africa. We didn't ask them to be here. They wanted to be here because of our architecture, financial architecture, etc. And of course, having 600 companies means a great deal for employment. So, politics is about the balance of forces. You might be really upset with the US, around some issues, but at the same time, you want the US. The challenge we face with the US is we have AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunities Act. That's been really confusing. What is AGOA? It gives South Africa preferential access to the US market, and that's really important for us. It's really confusing, but I think we've been renewed for a year, right? So that also makes the US important, and it's the largest economy in the world. So how do we engage the US? There are different ways in which you can engage power. One is you can reject power, but we cannot do that. Venezuela did that, said, to hell with you, we have oil. We can't embrace power of the US because, there are a whole range of feelings about the US, but we can engage power, right? We might not reject it or embrace it, but we can engage it. And I think that's what we're doing. When the US talks to us, we can appease them, right? We can say, well, about tariffs, let's think about it like this. But I think what is really important is we start thinking about contingencies. We start thinking about pivoting more to countries like China. We're often told about the health sector and PEPFAR and the contributions the US makes, $500 million plus. And China's not coming close to that. But certainly we need to be engaging China more. We need to be thinking about pivoting to the East more. So we can't disengage the US. I think we engage them. We talk about appeasement, but at the same time we think very carefully about contingency. And the contingency here is in large part for me the East. I think the other contingency is about intra-Africa trade. It's only about 16 or 18% compared to Europe, which it's, I think 40, 50%. So we're not trading enough within the country, within the continent. In terms of tourism, I think we're seeing an increase in that within the continent. But certainly we need to trade more in Africa.
Yeah, we're going to be touching on intra-Africa trade later on, and of course the China element that comes into that, Dr. Burkus. But I'm just going to read what we have, read from some of the leaders that have come here, and I want to take one that I think was quite important. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, of course, he has really praised the way South Africa have conducted its G20 presidency. A very similar rhetoric or comment that has come from Emmanuel Macron from France. The reason why I'm bringing this up, Dr. Burkus, is that because these are two important nations within the global context of how politics and economics works. Those statements coming from them, and of course the key trading partners of the United States also, and we'll touch on the US-South Africa relations at this moment. Their support for South Africa during this year's presidency, is it highly impactful, or is it just words that are coming given where they are right now?
I think it is impactful. The one message it's communicating is South Africa has not been pushed to the periphery by global north nations. And it's saying perhaps the anomaly here is the US. It's not all of the global north nations. And having countries like France and the UK, who carry huge geopolitical gravitas, is certainly important for us. And of course the sort of charisma with which these world leaders approach South Africa, that political decorum with which they engage South Africa, we're certainly not seeing from the US. Trump is not an ideologue. For Trump, governance is a big business. It's about, in his words, making a deal. And, politics are not about just making deals. And Trump could be your friend in the morning and quite a serious enemy in the afternoon. So that kind of engagement with Trump and the US is very worrisome for us in terms of our own engagement with the world. Who knows, things might change after the Trump administration, bar the fact that we might have a continuation of Trumpism which,
Yeah.
of course, we hope doesn't happen.
Yeah, and I mean, Trump has said that he would like to run for a third term, which is unheard of within the Constitution of the United States. I just want to, there's another, we spoke about a unanimous decision, so President Ramaphosa saying that the decision was a unanimous one. And again, I just want to also, this is a nice comment that is coming from the Vice President of Indonesia. A few weeks ago, of course, they were at the ASEAN summit, which of course was quite huge in terms of how trade is being done in the South Asian Pacific. The President, Gibran Raka, congratulating South Africa for hosting the first G20 summit in Africa under a difficult year. So I think South Africa's G20 presidency, I think there's a consensus from the global south that, look, this has been a very difficult year, given what has happened with this sort of difficulty with Washington, D.C. But the Asian nations, for me, I think have got a huge role to play because it's such a solid market that exists within South Asia, Dr. Pakas.
Yeah, South Asia, Southeast Asia with ASEAN, I think certainly a solid market that needs to be explored more. And we have a number of friends in Southeast Asia, particularly a country like Indonesia. Of course, we can talk about Malaysia, but even if you think about Anwar Ibrahim, he has a huge connection historically to the Islamic movement here, to the Muslim youth movement, and that's the reason many people, even in the MYM, would know him historically. And of course, Indonesia has a huge link to South Africa in terms of Islam in the Western Cape, Sheikh Yusuf, Makassar, and that coming of Islam to South Africa from the Indonesian archipelago. 55 is Bandung, Indonesia supportive of South Africa historically, good relationships now, and it's a massively powerful country. So yes, you're right. I think more exploration needs to happen in that regard with Indonesia, and not enough is happening. So certainly the Southeast Asian market is a big one that needs to be explored. And perhaps the other point to make is that ASEAN is like BRICS, tilting power relations with the global north, asserting itself, becoming stronger. And now we have Indonesia in BRICS. So there's this as a very late entrant. And this cross-cutting global south fora internationally is really strengthening the position of the global south.
Dr. Pakas, I want to read something that's come from the Finnish representative, and of course, praising South Africa's G20 presidency, also saying that there needs to be a understanding of the global economic context of everything. But in 3 minutes, Dr. Pakas, Finland, the Nordic nations, they seem to be, in my opinion, really under the radar, and yet, you've got nations there with great supreme wealth, like Finland, like Norway, who are really a European nation, or European bloc of nations that are kind of being just swept under the carpet.
They are, and again, if you'd forgive me, I'd go back to the history. I mean, these nations have always been
Dr. Pakas, I have to stop you there because I think the guest needs to come through. I think
That's
we will
fine.
continue that conversation after the break. We'll have more for you here on Mzansi Welcomes the World. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to Mzansi. Welcome as well. Let me welcome my next guest, Lerato Mataboge. She's the African Union Commissioner for Infrastructure, Energy and Digitization. Lerato, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, Lerato, the declaration has been, according to President Cyril Ramaphosa, unanimously adopted. How important is this from an African perspective?
Yes, indeed, the declaration has been adopted and we're quite pleased as African Union.
Lerato, I'm going to ask you just to lift the mic slightly up. Thank you so much.
Great.
You can continue.
We had quite a pivotal role to play as well in the agenda setting of the G20 because the African Union is now an official member of the G20 and we've contributed in the different tracks of work, not just in the G20 official tracks but also the engagement tracks, your B20 and many other engagement tracks. So some of our work has found expression as well in the declaration. For example, the AI for Africa initiative, because the digital agenda is quite a big area of work for the African Union. So we're quite pleased. It's quite a great day today.
Lerato, the artificial intelligence, I had Solly Malatsi earlier on, the Minister for Communications in South Africa, and he said regulation. How close or how far are we to Africa? Because we know there are great African minds that really want to adopt artificial intelligence. All they're looking for is guidance in terms of regulation. Has there been this discussion, especially given the context of South Africa's G20 presidency?
Absolutely. We now officially have an AI strategy that has been endorsed and supported by African Union member states, all 55 of them. Now the issue is about the domestication of the strategy. But, you know, with the rollout of AI, there are many issues to be considered. As you mentioned, issues of governance. I mean, data governance is one big area of work. Sovereignty of data is one big area of work. The AI infrastructure, right? The hard infrastructure required for AI on the African continent is another huge area of work that we need to look at. Security. Cybersecurity is another area of work that we're looking at. So there's quite a number of key policy and governance issues that we're looking at with our member states as the African Union as continuation of the work before we can really say that we are where we need to be when it comes to the digital agenda.
Lerato, how much of the pledges in terms of infrastructure in Africa needs to be put to a priority level, given that Africa, as a developing continent, has to get that support from the developed nations? How much are you hoping that, given this declaration, that this action can happen in terms of development within the African continent?
The African continent right now, we still have, it's been quantified to be about 150 million US dollars required per annum up until 2030 to close our infrastructure gap. So that number still remains. I mean, we still require quite huge amount of financial resources to close that gap. Now the question though, and the approach has slightly changed for us because we are now focusing more as well on African domestic resource mobilization. It's quite important that we get support and pledges from abroad, but we're also mindful that within the African continent we have resources. So how do we then unlock those resources? Resources that are lying in pension funds, for example, that are not deployed in the real economy, in sovereign wealth funds on the continent, in our multilateral organizations or DFIs on the continent. So we're having a conversation around how do we begin to unlock African resources for our own infrastructure and crowd in partner funding. So yes, we do need pledges from all over the world, but we're also quite focused on mobilizing African resources.
Lerato, one final question, because I know you need to go. How would you sum up in 1 minute South Africa's G20 presidency for 2025?
Outstanding. Outstanding.
Historic?
Outstanding, historic, fantastic, pivotal. It has shaped the agenda and repositioned the African continent to where it needs to be.
Lerato Mataboge, absolute pleasure having you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
That is Lerato Mataboge from the African Union. Do stay tuned, because immediately after this, Dr. Imran Bakkes will be back to continue our analysis of day one of the G20 Leaders Summit. Well, welcome back to Mzansi Welcomes the World. We're on Hilal TV session 2 of the G20 Leaders Summit. Dr. Bacchus, if I rudely interrupted you there
that's
on,
fine, that's fine, yeah.
you know, on the Nordic nations.
Yes.
Again, you know, they're really flying under this radar in terms of Europe, and there's great resources within those part of Europe.
Yeah, no, like I was saying earlier, I mean, you know, these countries have a long history with South Africa. All of the Scandinavian countries, in fact, but particularly Sweden. You know, the Swedes lost a president in the 80s, and the sort of allegations are that it was because of his support of South Africa. And, you know, some of the ANC songs, liberation songs, still mention his name. So that's important. And places like Uppsala, the funding of the ANC's underground, all came out of Sweden particularly, but Scandinavia broadly. So yes, that's a part of Europe that we need to explore. There's a number of lessons we can learn. Norway does really well, very high taxation, but you know, its population lives really well. The one thing we can learn from them is the fact that they have a wealth tax, a sovereign fund. And that sovereign fund comes out of the proceeds of oil. And, you know, that contributes to the well-being of the Norwegian people. And we know from their access to health, education, etc., etc. What are the lessons we can learn from Southern Africa? You know, as the debate pivots more and more to critical minerals, and we know Africa has a significant amount of those critical minerals. Mozambique has a sovereign fund, but it needs to ensure that it's a sovereign fund that you know, operates effectively. If it does, all indications are that Mozambique can come out of poverty. But you know, there are questions already about corruption, and that we constantly come back to that. Corruption, corruption, corruption. And maybe we need to talk about why so much of corruption on the African continent.
And that's the thing. Surely, Dr. Bacchus, we can't just say it's a liberation movement supposed rhetoric. Yes, could be part of it, but I would like to think that it's not just about that. Why is it the case with Africa? Is it a colonial sort of hangover that has happened? Or is it something that, as within the continent, there has to be a deep think about how we're running it? I must confess that when you look at Burkina Faso and the work being done by its president, Ibrahima Traoré, that just really stands out as probably a norm, or sorry, the exception to the norm that we are seeing within the continent.
So multiple points there, right? One is you described it as, you know, could it be a feature of a post-colonial order? Yeah, absolutely. You know, perhaps one of the greatest political scientists, political thinkers was Frantz Fanon, who was really writing about, in the context of the Algerian war, he was from Martinique, fought for the French in the World War, and then in Martinique. And he wrote this book, The Wretched of the Earth. And one of those chapters, called The Pitfalls of National Consciousness, he talks about exactly that, right? That those who were oppressed, those who were part of the liberation struggle, when they come to power, they focus on looting the public purse, right? In order to enrich themselves. And I think it gets a lot worse than that, right? Corruption has a number of impacts. And one of the really worrying impacts it can have, I know people might say, you're talking about corruption in Africa, what about corruption in the US? Because there's massive corruption, right?
No, and I think it's been quite exposed during the Trump administration.
Administration, but also before that. You know, we had the death of Dick Cheney recently. But if you think about Iraq, you know, what happens in Iraq? The US blows Iraq to smithereens and then says we'll rebuild it. And who gets the contracts? You know, Halliburton, Dick Cheney, etc. That's corruption. You know, and Trump, and we're seeing that all the time.
And Gaza also. Take a guess who's in charge of the sort of quote-unquote peace plan? Jared Kushner.
Yeah.
Donald Trump's son-in-law.
Yeah, I mean, you kill people, thousands of people, and then you make money out of that. And money is made out of war. So that's a huge problem in the global south and in terms of corruption, that we want to mimic the colonizer in terms of our acquisition of wealth. But if I can digress slightly, similar questions have been asked about some of our politicians like Malema. There was a question asked about Malema in the early days, before him donning the makarapa and his overalls. Well, there was a moment in which he wore his Italian suit and his Breitling watch, and he went into one of the townships and he proclaimed socialism. Now, of course, there's deep irony in that, and optically, the optics are really awkward. And the audience, or the people he was talking to, clapped. And people were trying to understand, why would masses of people celebrate this when they have no money and the guy's wearing a, $30,000, $40,000 watch, right? And they're living on the margins. And then someone tried to explain it by suggesting that Malema might care about the poor, but his Italian suit and his watch is an indication of, the rescuing of historical humiliation. As a young black person in South Africa, with my parents being, helpers in people's households and my father not having a job, I was not recognized. You didn't look at me at all. And now you have to notice me. I've arrived. So it's understandable. That rescuing of humiliation in post-colonial societies is absolutely understandable. The problem, however, is the way it's done. This conspicuous consumption, this looting of money in a way that's really, we're seeing this now with the Malanga Commission, and we're used to it in South Africa. We've seen it so many times. So that's the one problem. There was another point that you raised beyond the colonial order. I forget it now. Maybe it'll come back.
No. I think the question, there were two aspects that I asked Dr. Buckus is it sort of a liberation movement sort of aspect to it, that you can rescue the people from the colonizer, but when you are in power, it kind of seems as if governance is your biggest challenge, and hence it's sort of a helter-skelter way in the way the running of a country is done. Look at Zimbabwe with the ZANU-PF. The ZANU-PF may say, well, it's because of the sanctions that were enforced on us by the Bush and Blair administration. But that is where I think the challenge lies, is that can liberation movements, and especially now in the G20 context, where we're asking ourselves, if the global north's going to come into power, how do we then assist in that regards with countries that still have this sort of liberation movement aspect to them?
No, sure. Liberation movement governance is interesting to understand. So, the one point is that I made earlier, 3, 4, 5 decades, they get pushed to the periphery. Corruption sets in, infighting, etc., etc. The other thing to think about when it comes to liberation movements is that they're complex. Think about the ANC. It has two main traditions historically. It has what we call an exile tradition. The Thabo Mbekis, the Aziz Pahards, and everyone else that were in London and studying at Sussex, and people spread across Europe and the African continent. The culture they come with politically is very different from another tradition in the ANC that we call the internal tradition. Those who were in prison, those who were in the underground, and it's not unique to the ANC, right? Even if you think about the PLO, historically, people in exile, people within the country, and multiple other movements. Those who were in exile don't have a very consultative way about them. We saw that with Mbeki. Plays his cards close to his chest. He's Machiavellian. He trusts Isop Pahad and others, but not too many people around him. Those within the country, like Mandela, have a more embracing tradition. And of course, Zuma straddles both, right? 66 to 76 in prison, comes out, leads the ANC in its intelligence efforts, underground, etc. So you bring these two traditions together, and neither of them have been adequately prepared for governance. Perhaps the exile tradition to an extent, but you have an internal tradition, you have an archipelago of NGOs assisting them and the UDF, etc. But revolutionary politics is very different from being in government, right? So when they come into power, they have several problems. The one is they are democratic but also dictatorial. So when you're in exile, you're fighting for democracy, but you don't always have the luxury of being democratic. So if you're in exile and you're given an instruction, you don't ask why. You carry out the instruction, there are security concerns, etc., etc. So dictatorial, also democratic. And we saw that with Mbeki. Right? Dictatorial, it has to be my way, I'm the intellectual superstar. And the other problems with liberation movements is that they sometimes have an uneasy relationship with the constitution. We are the custodians of the liberation, and of course you need to listen to us, right? So all of these are problems that liberation movements bring to governance, and that leads to them, besides not being able to deliver on services after a while, it leads to them being pushed out of government.
What's interesting about what you're speaking here, Dr. Burkus, is the revolutionary politics. Most, if not all, liberation movements or most African countries have adopted the sort of socialism way of doing things. I don't know, in my view, Dr. Burkus, when you look at the global economic context, capitalism seems to be ruling the roost. And when you see, for example, right here in South Africa, we question whether an organization like the South African Communist Party has relevance within the South African economic sphere. And that for me is where I think when you look at G20 and the context of it, it seems to be more capital driven. Now, can Africa, because when you hear and this is the ANC, ZANU-PF and all other supposed liberation movements within the country, a lot of it seems to be, it is a socialist way of doing things. So when they go to their constituency, they're saying it's socialism driven. Meanwhile, I love what you mentioned about Julius Malema before, obviously the EFF, the Italian suits, the watches. The politicians live a capitalist life, none more so than our current president, who of course comes from this capital background. Where do we find the balance in that, Dr. Burkus, when you look at it from that perspective? Because I just find it very hard to see how this is going to work when the politics is revolutionary and equaling to that a socialist perspective.
Yeah, okay, so interesting question, complex question, multiple parts to it. One is liberation movements in large part come out of a Cold War and influenced by the Eastern Bloc, USSR, East Germany, Cuba, and a number of other countries that come out of the Eastern Bloc. So of course, and what was the Cold War about? It was about essentially capitalism versus socialism. You had a proxy war on the African continent, and countries aligned mainly to the Eastern Bloc. If you think about the All Guard in the ANC, Mac Barrage and others, they were all in the Eastern Bloc, right? Being trained, a number of people were in the USSR, etc., etc. So that influence in part comes from there. And, the seduction of liberation movements and socialism. And then when you come into power, Frelimo declares itself a Marxist state, a Leninist Marxist state. You hear Malema talk today, he talks about being Marxist, Leninist, he talks about being Fanonian. Of course, I think some of they might be turning in their grave listening to Malema describe the EFF as Fanonian. So there's that seduction, right? But you're right. Again, people don't make history in the context of their choosing. How can you be socialist when the governing order is capitalist? You might well say, well, Mamdani claims to be socialist within a sea of capital, at the heart of capitalism. But the point is, it's highly contested, right? To survive with socialism, in a neoliberal order, it's almost impossible because you have to give in to the logic of capital. The problem also is when you spoke about communist parties, I can't think of a communist party that's communist.
But that's the thing, because that would have happened, Dr. Pakas, in the early days of the Soviet Union, its formation, when, of course, the revolution had happened in Russia. That's a very long time ago. That's over 100 years ago. Things have changed. When you have organizations like the IMF, the World Trade Organization, World Economic Forum meetings, when you have all of this happening, I do look at communism or anything that's related to it, whether it's the offspring of Marxism or Fanonism or any of those ideologies, and I think they really don't exist. And of course, from a South African context basis, the need for SACP, I just think it's an optics that we have the SACP as part of this tripartite alliance. Even the ANC, even if they do go ahead and scream socialism, there isn't anything. You look at their leaders and they're practicing something different. So I just think that this sort of rhetoric of a socialist way of doing it, or whatever little remnants of communism still exists, there is nothing there. And I just feel that the rest of Africa, who still have this within them, and this includes our country, needs to look at the world differently, because it is a world of capital, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, so a few issues with that, right?
Sure.
So one is, I don't think we're thinking about governance today in the classical sense of isms. We're not thinking about an iteration of Russian socialism. We're not thinking about a Cuban socialism or Cabral's socialism, right? Or even Kaunda's socialism. But what we're thinking about today is, I don't think we can talk about isms. Yes, you're right, there's no socialist order. But what we're talking about today is a kind of social democracy. And what that means is ensuring that you limit the influence of capital, ensuring that people have bread and butter, electricity, water, roads and bridges, and that you don't rely solely on the logic of capital. What is capitalism? It tells us that, besides maximizing profits, the neoliberal order says, don't worry about the poor people, you need to have growth, you need to have employment, and then you can have redistribution. The kind of GEAR acronym that I'm using to explain that. Essentially what it's saying is not necessarily GEAR, it applies generically. It's saying that markets should deliver. You can't allow the state to intervene with health, with education, with essential services. All of these things are commodities in the US. We think about electricity as a service. In the US, it's a commodity. You are the client. You want electricity, go to a service provider. You want health, private health. You don't have it, too bad. In South Africa, we think of it differently. State hospitals, people who can't afford public health care, etc. So we're not thinking about isms, perhaps in the way you're describing historically, but we're thinking about it, in the modern era, impacting people's lives. Because no country today, I think, on the African continent can claim to be socialist. Frelimo talks about being Marxist-Leninist, but they're hardcore capitalist in so many ways. You asked about the Communist Party. We can think about multiple communist parties, right? You think about the South African Communist Party, it emerges in the 1920s. The kind of intellectual heartland or gravitas comes out of the Jewish left. Incredible people persecuted in the USSR, other parts of Europe. They know what it feels like to be oppressed. Albie Sachs, Ruth Furs, the Goldsteins, etc. Castrol's family, they come back and they have this Communist Party. It's really influential. It impacts Mandela, etc. The Chinese Communist Party emerges in about the same era. But what happens to communist parties today? They're capitalist, right? I don't know of a communist party that's communist.
But even the Chinese Communist Party has an element of capital to them, because look at the trades that they do in various stock exchanges. I mean, Tencent trades, if I stand to be corrected, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, which of course, Naspers has a sort of influence there or shares there. So I don't know. I just think the word communist, and you've put it quite well, it's not the communist of Russia or the one that Karl Marx sort of envisioned. It just really is an optical word that is there, and that's about it. But the way business is done and the way the markets conduct itself is completely that of capitalism.
Yeah. And of course, countries need to adapt. And if you think about the maverick Machiavellian nature of Thabo Mbeki, he was pushing privatization. He was pushing capitalism, if you like. And the dilemma he faced is he had some really senior members of the Communist Party in his cabinet. What do? He did it brilliantly. He had Alec Erwin, if I remember correctly, was the Minister of Trade and Industry. Hardcore communist. Or public enterprises, maybe. What he does,
I think it was public enterprises.
Yeah,
it was public enterprises, yes.
So what he does is he takes a communist minister, or a minister who comes from a SACP background, and he places him in charge of privatization. Now then you can see the ideological schizophrenia that someone like Alec Erwin would face. And that's the point I'm making. You can't stick to an ism. You adapt to government. You adapt to what's happening. And that's the dilemma many Muslim politicians face in South Africa. How can you be, how do you adapt to a liberal order? So that's a huge, huge challenge for governments. I kind of lost my chain of thought. I was going to say something else.
No. I think you've put it quite easily there, Dr. Burkus, in terms of just how this has happened, because when you have these financial institutions, there's absolutely no way the system can work. So, I mean, the adaptability of the African continent right now, this is a true litmus test for them. And I think South Africa's G20 presidency will probably put that into the arc of the commitments are going to come from the global north, but we need to go ahead and change the way we deliver in terms of economies across the world.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And I've got 3 minutes for you because we are going to take a break, Dr. Burkus. Yeah?
Okay, I was going to say 2 minutes actually, slightly light-hearted, but maybe let me go back.
I think let's go with light-hearted before we go to the break, Dr.
I have
Burkus.
this urge to tell it. I'm not the greatest at telling light-hearted stories,
right?
But, and it relates to the SACP.
Yeah.
You had, a leading member of the SACP that, I knew really well, Dale McKinley.
Oh, yes.
And
was a political economist at this moment. Yeah.
And of course many other people, at Wits and things who were part of the Communist Party. And at one moment he's expelled from the Communist Party, right? And he comes out of that room and the media, is there to interview him. And I recall a journalist asking him, why were you expelled from the Communist Party? And he said, for advancing communism. And that really was the reason.
Because that's the party that's supposed to be advancing it.
But the Communist Party had to become less tolerant of these communist tendencies, because it's the Mbeki administration, it's privatizing, it's becoming really neoliberal. So how on earth can a communist advance communism? And that's the dilemmas, and that's the kind of contradictions of politics.
You know what they say, we live in a complex world. Definitely. Dr. Burkus, I think we're going to be taking a break now, and obviously when we do come back, We're going to wrapping up session 3, of course, just how the day has progressed, but an important conversation. You know, I know we talked of communism, but China and its influence within the African continent. So that's a conversation myself and Dr. Perkins will be taking forward when session 3 takes over. So do stay tuned to us here on Hilal TV for Mzansi Welcomes the World. We will see you later on. We'll be back with more from day 1 of the G20 Leaders Summit in Nasrec, Johannesburg.
2, we call on multilateral development banks to create dedicated credit lines for regional and urban development. We urge the summit to adopt a multi-pronged approach on fiscal space, financial innovation, and institutional capacity as the foundation of a new global economic architecture. And finally, we call for a recommitment to the multilateral trading system that we are used to. Thank you.
Thank you, President Mahadabio. Your Excellencies, I'd like to announce that we will be taking a family photo in about half an hour, in 30 minutes, when we have finished the guest country speakers list, which we will finish shortly. Thereafter, we will take a family photo and stretch our legs before we come to listen to the inputs from international organizations. I now call upon His Excellency, Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of the Republic of Singapore, Mr. Lawrence Wong, to take the floor.
Thank you, President Ramaphosa. Excellencies, I start by thanking President Ramaphosa and the South African government for the excellent arrangements and for inviting Singapore to this historic G20 summit, the first time on African soil. The agenda today is on growth, and growth can only be sustained in a stable global environment. For decades, the rules-based multilateral system anchored by the WTO provided this stability. But the system is now under severe strain. One reason is that the system has been optimized for efficiency in a different era, and it has not caught up with the realities of today's world, realities like digital trade, as well as the fact that interdependencies are increasingly being seen as vulnerabilities and are open to being weaponized or used as leverage in moments of dispute. Understandably, countries are taking actions to protect themselves and to prioritize resilience and security. Yet, if every nation goes its own way, the global system will unravel even more quickly. And when that happens, everyone will be worse off. And the heaviest burden will fall on the developing nations. So we do need to reform and update the global system to ensure it addresses the strategic realities of our time. First, we must recommit to the core foundations which remain relevant today, and that means upholding international law and the norms and practices that guide state behavior. That is critical to continued peace and stability in the world. Second, we must reform the current system, be it the WTO or other global institutions. We cannot be paralyzed by old ways of doing things. We all have to get behind the urgent reforms that are needed in the WTO so that it becomes more effective and outcome-oriented. We should complement the WTO with flexible multilateral approaches, and that's why Singapore supports minilaterals and plurilaterals, which can serve as important pathfinders towards updating global rules. Third, we should build new partnerships, and as several colleagues have talked about just now, we are making progress with partnerships and dialogues between the CPTPP and ASEAN, as well as the CPTPP and the EU. In fact, 2 days ago, ministers came together and had a very productive trade and investment dialogue covering issues like trade and investment facilitation, digital trade, and supply chain resilience. In the same regard, we should look at ways in which we can bring the free trade areas and the free trade blocks in Africa closer with Southeast Asia and ASEAN. Recently, Singapore also joined with other countries like New Zealand, Switzerland, and the UAE to launch a new framework called the Future of Investment and Trade Partnership that brings together small and medium-sized economies to keep up the momentum of trade liberalization. All of these efforts can form the foundations of a more resilient and secure multilateral trading system. To be clear, building a new global economic architecture will require significant effort and considerable political will. Multiple efforts are already underway, as I described just now. The G20 can and should play a key leadership role in coordinating these efforts, and Singapore stands ready to do our part and work with all members towards this objective. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister Wong. I now move on and request His Excellency, the Prime Minister of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, Mr. Phang Minh Chinh, to take the floor.
Thưa Ngài Phú Hộ Sa, thưa các nhà lãnh đạo và quý vị đại biểu, tôi xin chúc mừng Ngài Tổng thống và Chính phủ Nam Phi đã đảm nhận vai trò Chủ tịch G20 năm 2015 và đánh giá cao chủ đề đoàn kết, bình đẳng, phát triển bền vững. Thế giới đang trải qua những thay đổi sâu sắc mang tính thời đại, nhiều vấn đề chưa có tiền lệ mang tính toàn dân, toàn diện và toàn cầu. Trong bối cảnh đó, quản trị toàn cầu cần hướng tới mục tiêu trọng tâm là duy trì hòa bình, ổn định và phát triển bao trùm toàn diện. Nguyên tắc quan trọng nhất là tôn trọng